At 14:30 hours on December 18, 1944, Private First Class David Coleman stood in front of an M4 Sherman tank in the frozen courtyard of a Belgian farmhouse, trying to understand what the sergeant was telling him. Coleman was 19 years old. He had been in Europe for 11 days. He was a replacement infantryman. He had never been inside a tank. He had never fired a tank gun. He had never even operated a radio more complex than a field telephone. The sergeant was explaining that Coleman's new job was tank commander. The reason was simple and brutal. The 7th Armored Division had been fighting in Belgium for 6 days straight. They had lost 40% of their armor in the first 3 days of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. They had lost tank commanders faster than they could replace them. The division was pulling men from anywhere they could find them. Infantry, artillery, supply units, even the cooks. Coleman had been walking to his infantry unit when an officer stopped him and asked if he could drive. Coleman said yes. The officer pointed at the Sherman and said, "You're a tanker now. Report to Sergeant Dawson." That had been 10 minutes ago. Sergeant Dawson was 34 years old. He had been fighting tanks since North Africa. He was supposed to train Coleman for 2 weeks. Instead, he had 24 hours. The division was moving out tomorrow morning at a 600 to counterattack a German Panzer column that had broken through American lines near St. Vith. Every tank they could field mattered, even tanks commanded by 19-year-old infantry replacements who didn't know the difference between a transmission and a turret. Dawson started with the basics. This is the M4 Sherman. Weight, 33 tons. Main gun, 75 mm. Secondary armament, 1. 50 caliber machine gun, 2. 30 caliber machine guns. Crew, 5 men, driver, co-driver, gunner, loader, commander. Coleman's job was commander. He would sit in the turret. He would identify targets. He would give orders to the gunner. He would coordinate with other tanks via radio. He would keep his crew alive. Dawson opened the commander's hatch and told Coleman to climb in. The interior of the Sherman was cramped and cold. Metal everywhere. Levers, gauges, ammunition racks, the smell of oil and cordite. Coleman squeezed into the commander's position. The turret felt smaller than a closet. He could barely move his shoulders. Dawson showed him the controls. Turret rotation, gun elevation, radio frequencies, fire control. He explained how to load different types of ammunition: armor-piercing for tanks, high explosive for infantry, white phosphorus for smoke. Coleman tried to remember it all. He wrote notes on his hand with a pencil: turret left, turret right, load AP, load HE, fire command. After 2 hours, Dawson took Coleman outside and showed him German tank identification. He had photographs pinned to a wooden board. Panzer IV, Panther, Tiger. He explained the differences. The Panzer Coyote had a short barrel. The Panther had sloped armor. The Tiger was massive. He explained kill zones. The Panther's frontal armor was 80 mm thick. A Sherman's 75 mm gun couldn't penetrate it from the front. Coleman would need to hit it from the side or rear. The weak points were the engine deck, the turret ring, and the lower hull. Coleman asked what happened if they met a Tiger head-on. Dawson said, "You run, or you die." At 1800 hours, Dawson introduced Coleman to his crew. The driver was a corporal named Jackson, 26 years old, from Georgia. He had been driving Shermans since Normandy. The co-driver was a private named Torres, 21 years old, from Texas. He operated the bow machine gun. The gunner was a private first class named O'Brien, 23 years old, from Boston. He had been a gunner for 4 months. The loader was a private named Kowalski, 20 years old, from Michigan. He had been loading shells for 3 months. They all looked at Coleman like he was a problem they had to solve. Jackson asked Coleman how many tank battles he had been in. Coleman said, "None." O'Brien asked if Coleman had ever fired a 75 mm gun. Coleman said, "No." Kowalski asked if Coleman knew how to read a map. Coleman said, "Yes." That was true. He had been trained in land navigation during basic training. Torres didn't ask anything. He just shook Coleman's head and said, "Welcome to the steel coffin, sir." For the next 6 hours, Dawson drilled Coleman on tank combat. They sat in the Sherman with the engine running, practicing commands. Coleman would call out targets. O'Brien would traverse the turret and simulate firing. Kowalski would simulate loading. Jackson would maneuver the tank around the courtyard. Dawson watched and corrected. Faster, clearer, louder. The radio crackled constantly. Coleman had to learn to communicate while watching for threats, while giving orders, while tracking their position. At midnight, Dawson called a break. The crew climbed out of the Sherman and sat in the snow drinking coffee from canteens. Nobody talked much. In the distance, they could hear artillery. The front line was 12 miles away. Dawson told Coleman the most important thing. Your job isn't to be a hero. Your job is to keep your crew alive. You see a Panther, you call it out, you let O'Brien do his job. You see infantry, you suppress them with machine guns. You take fire, you back up and reposition. You never sit still. A stationary tank is a dead tank. Coleman asked how many Shermans Dawson had commanded. Dawson said, 4, lost the first 3. This is number 4. At 200 hours, Coleman tried to sleep in the farmhouse. He couldn't. His mind kept running through the commands. Turret left, traverse right, load AP, fire, load he, fire, identify, engage, reposition. At 5:45 hours, the division formed up. 18 Sherman tanks, 3 M10 tank destroyers, 1 M26 Pershing heavy tank. They rolled out of the courtyard in column formation, moving east toward St. Vith. Coleman sat in the commander's hatch wearing a tanker's helmet with an integrated radio headset. The day was overcast and brutally cold. Snow covered everything. The column moved slowly through frozen roads, past destroyed villages, past abandoned German equipment. At 0730 hours, they reached the staging area. The battalion commander briefed the tank commanders via radio. German armor had been spotted moving through a forest 3 kilometers northeast. Estimated 8 to 12 tanks. Probably Panthers, possibly Tigers. The American objective was to intercept and destroy them before they reached the main supply route. Coleman's Sherman was assigned to the 2nd Platoon, middle position. They would advance in line formation across an open field, using the tree line for cover. At 08:15 hours, the attack began. The Shermans moved forward across the snow-covered field. Coleman stood in the commander's hatch, scanning the tree line through binoculars. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline. The radio crackled. All units, eyes open, we're entering the engagement zone. Coleman could see movement in the trees, dark shapes, metal. He grabbed the radio handset. 23 to 21, I have possible contacts. Tree line, 11 o'clock. The platoon leader responded. 21 confirms. All units, load armor piercing, stand by. Coleman dropped into the turret. Kowalski, load AP. The loader slammed a 75mm armor-piercing shell into the breach. AP loaded. O'Brien traversed the turret left, on target. The German tanks opened fire first. The sound was like nothing Coleman had experienced. A massive crack followed by a supersonic whine. A Panther's 75mm shell hit the Sherman next to Coleman's, punching through the turret and exploding inside. The tank stopped moving. Smoke poured from the hatches. The radio exploded with voices. Contact. Panthers in the trees. 2-5 is hit. 2-5 is burning. Coleman's instinct was to freeze, to duck, to hide. Instead, he shouted, Driver, left 20 degrees. Gunner, Panther, tree line, 200 yards. Jackson swung the Sherman left. O'Brien traversed the turret. Coleman saw the Panther through his periscope, a massive beast with sloped armor and a long gun. On target, O'Brien shouted. Fire, Coleman ordered. The Sherman rocked backward as the 75mm gun fired. The shell hit the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted off in a shower of sparks. No penetration, O'Brien shouted. Coleman remembered what Dawson had taught him. Don't engage Panthers from the front. Reposition. Flank. Driver, reverse. Get us behind that barn. Jackson threw the Sherman into reverse. They backed up 50 yards, using a destroyed barn for cover. Coleman's heart was hammering. The crew was looking at him, waiting for orders. Through the smoke and snow, Coleman could see 3 Panthers advancing across the field. They were spreading out, professional, coordinating their fire. Behind them, more shapes. 5, 6, 8 German tanks. The American Shermans were outgunned. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 1,000 yards. The Sherman's 75mm couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range. Coleman grabbed the radio. 23 to 21. I count 8 Panthers. Recommend flanking maneuver. The platoon leader didn't respond. His tank had been hit. The radio was silent. Coleman realized he was in command now. His platoon, 5 Shermans, against 8 Panthers. He made a decision. All 2 units, this is 2-3. We can't fight them head-on. Follow me. We're going left, using the forest for cover. We'll hit them from the flank. 4 Sherman tanks peeled off and followed Coleman. They moved fast, staying low, using terrain and trees for concealment. The Panthers were focused on the main body of American tanks. They didn't see Coleman's group circling wide. Coleman's Sherman burst from the tree line 300 yards to the left of the German formation. Now he could see the Panthers from the side, their vulnerable flank armor. Gunner, Panther, right side, 300 yards. O'Brien traversed. On target. Fire. The 75mm shell hit the Panther in the side, penetrating the thinner armor and detonating the ammunition inside. The Panther exploded in a ball of orange flame. Target destroyed, O'Brien screamed. Coleman didn't celebrate. Kowalski, reload. Driver, forward. Next target. The other 4 Shermans in Coleman's group opened fire. At this range, from this angle, their guns could kill Panthers. A second Panther took a hit in the engine deck and stopped moving, trailing smoke. A third tried to traverse its turret but took 2 shells in rapid succession and exploded. The German formation broke. They had expected to fight Shermans from the front, where they were invincible. They hadn't expected to be flanked. The surviving Panthers reversed, trying to reposition, trying to bring their heavy frontal armor to bear. Coleman pressed the advantage. All units, advance. Keep hitting them from the side. His Sherman closed the distance. O'Brien fired again. Another hit. Another kill. The Panther's turret blew off completely, spinning through the air like a toy. 4 Panthers destroyed. The remaining 4 were retreating into the forest. Coleman's radio crackled. It was the battalion commander. 2-3, good work. Hold your position. We're sending reinforcements. Coleman's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the handset. 2-3 copies. The battle had lasted 14 minutes. The crew was silent. O'Brien was staring at the destroyed Panthers. Kowalski was sitting on the floor of the turret with his head in his hands. Jackson had stopped the tank and was breathing heavily. Torres was praying in Spanish. Coleman climbed out of the commander's hatch and sat on the turret, looking at the battlefield. 4 burning Panthers, 1 destroyed Sherman from his platoon. The rest had survived. Sergeant Dawson's Sherman rolled up beside Coleman's. Dawson climbed out and looked at the destroyed Panthers. Then he looked at Coleman. "How many hours of training did I give you?" Coleman's voice was hoarse. 24. Dawson nodded. "You just commanded your first tank battle. You flanked 8 Panthers. You killed 4. You saved your platoon." He paused. That was textbook. Coleman didn't feel like it was textbook. He felt like he had survived by accident, by luck, by making decisions faster than his fear could stop him. But the Panthers were destroyed. His crew was alive. That was what mattered. The battle near Sankt Vith continued for 2 more days. Coleman's Sherman engaged German armor 6 more times. They destroyed 4 more Panthers, 3 Panzer IVs, and 1 Tiger tank, though the Tiger required 3 Shermans firing simultaneously from 3 different angles. By December 21st, the German offensive had stalled. By January 1945, the Bulge had been pushed back. The war moved east. Coleman fought his Sherman across Belgium, into Germany, all the way to the Elbe River. He survived. His crew survived. Jackson, Torres, O'Brien, and Kowalski all made it home. In total, Coleman's Sherman was credited with 8 Panther kills, 7 Panzer IV kills, 1 Tiger kill, and 34 other armored vehicles destroyed over 5 months of combat. Coleman himself was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Silver Star for his actions on December 18, 1944, the day he commanded his first tank battle with 24 hours of training. After the war, Coleman returned to Ohio. He worked as a machinist. He married. He had 3 children. He almost never talked about the war. When his children asked what he did in Europe, he said, "I drove a tank." He didn't mention that he had learned to command that tank in 1 day and destroyed 8 German Panthers that same night. David Coleman died in 1994 at the age of 69. In his obituary, his family mentioned he was a veteran. They didn't mention he was one of the most effective tank commanders of the Battle of the Bulge. They didn't know. He never told them. Sergeant Dawson survived the war too. He retired from the Army in 1960. Before he died in 1987, he wrote a letter to the 7th Armored Division Veterans Association. In it, he mentioned Coleman. "I trained a lot of tank commanders. Most needed weeks. One needed a day. He was the best I ever saw." Sometimes war doesn't give you time to prepare. Sometimes you learn by doing. Sometimes a 19-year-old infantry replacement with 24 hours of training commands a Sherman tank against 8 Panthers and wins because he makes decisions faster than fear can stop him. 8 German tanks destroyed. One night. One crew. One kid who learned tank warfare in a frozen Belgian courtyard and became a tank commander by necessity. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure David Coleman doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.